My interest in this subject stemmed from some work I did a few years ago around the management of public space. And as part of that, as part of a series of projects I was doing, I became worried about the literature on public space, much of which comes out of the US. That's perhaps another import from America, and which has a sort of despairing pessimism around public space. And what we're creating, often situated in a criticism of neoliberalism and the property-led type of agenda that's been described. And if you look at that literature, which on public space has been growing and is now very extensive, you can really see 10 critiques of contemporary public space in our cities today. Quickly, those are that space is neglected. This plays into this cleaner, safer agenda, that we're neglecting space, rubbish strewn and so forth, poorly maintained. That space is invaded, most clearly by traffic, but also by some other aspects of society, for example, our alcohol-driven culture. That space is exclusionary. In particular, it's exclusionary for segments of society who find it perhaps more physically challenging to get around, or don't have the same sort of money resources that most of us have. That public space is segregated. We'd heard something about that. That increasingly space is being gated off. Those with wealth, for example, have the choice to gate themselves off from the rest of us. That public space is increasingly insular, or in fact we as society lead increasingly insular lives, buried in our iBooks or in our virtual spaces, rather than engaging with traditional public spaces of the city. Other critiques, we've heard a lot about this already, that space is privatised, that a lot of new space is privatised with the sort of issues that Anna was talking about. That space is too commercially driven, too consumption orientated. That much space is simply invented. We have themes that we import from all around the world and we apply them to places whether they are relevant or not. That space is scary, that people are afraid to use space, and that part of that is, as Anna was discussing, this idea around securitization of space, which in turn makes people more fearful. And finally, a set of critiques that public space is homogenized, partly because of all the other criticisms and critiques of public space, that we're creating places that are homogenized, and you see the same brands here and everywhere and all around the world. So some pretty fundamental criticisms, critiques around public space. And I suppose it's got me thinking, is it really that bad? Is our public space really so bad? And often if you start looking at these criticisms, they're based on very thin evidence, often drawn from a rather narrow North American set of literatures, and sometimes the evidence that there is distorted to fit a particular thesis. Now, my line of work as an academic, I'm fortunate enough to go around the world in various conferences, and the number of times I've heard this being quoted at me: London is the most surveilled city in the world. Now, if you look at the evidence for this statement, it's based on a little study of Putney High Street, not even the whole of Putney High Street, and the figures of CCTV cameras in Putney High Street have been replicated across London as if every street in London is the same as Putney High Street. And this is not an isolated example. often the evidence for these criticisms is very thin indeed. So I decided a couple of years ago to try and do a research project, and I was fortunate enough to get it funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, to look at public space in London, to try and develop a more empirical evidence base for some of these criticisms, many of which may very well be valid. We looked at new public spaces in London since 1980, of which there are about 300 across the city. We did detailed surveys of 130 of those, and then we did very detailed case study work on 14 public spaces dotted around London, although many of the new public spaces are concentrated on central and inner London. And this work also included a lot of work around users of public space and how actual users engage with public space and what they think of our public spaces in London. And the case studies, I'm just going to really focus on the results of the 14 detailed case studies. And those are classified or divided into a number of sets. These are the spaces that we looked at in detail. First, a couple of what you might call sort of corporate spaces, Canada Square in Canary Wharf, Paternoster Square in the City of London. Civic spaces, Trafalgar Square, which has been rejuvenated. So these weren't all new squares, but they were spaces that were either new or had been substantially regenerated in this period. Sloane Square, this was an example of a sort of failed project. Many of you will know the story of the attempts to regenerate Sloane Square, which really failed to get off the ground. Community space, we looked at Swiss Cottage Community Square, Peckham Square, and the Royal Arsenal Gardens in Woolwich. Consumption space, a space mainly devoted to consumption-type activities. The spaces we were looking at were Royal Festival Riverside, Gabriel's Wharf, and Euston Piazza. Domestic space, the Village Square in the Greenwich Millennium Village and Empire Square in Southwark, sometimes known as Tabard Square. And two spaces which were sort of spaces from the in-between, spaces that were sort of rather residual spaces but had been brought into a sort of new life, which were Somerset House Courtyard and Monument Yard. So a great diversity of spaces from around London of different types, reflecting different primary functions and purposes. So, what about the critiques? What did our analysis tell us about the critiques and the truth or otherwise of the different critiques? And here I managed to get all my... Oh, here we are. That's it. So the first one is London's public space neglected. Well, neglect is a permanent feature of London and London's physical fabric. It's partly a result of the sort of fragmented governance that London has and has always had, and the inevitable limit on resources that a city like London has to devote to its public space. And periodically, about every 50 years, this gives rise to a sort of outrage about the quality of our public space. It happened in the sort of Regency period, then there was the Victorian Parks movement, the immediate post-war period. There was lots of concern about rebuilding London alongside the traditional nature of spaces. And then the Urban Renaissance period, which in London actually predated the policies, because you could say, broadly speaking, from the mid-1990s, there's started to be a reinvestment. Each of these periods has seen a sort of profound enhancement in public space in London. And certainly when we talk to users of public spaces, they seemed, on the whole, very pleased or happy, I should say, with the stewardship of London, the stewardship of London's public spaces. But nevertheless, there's clearly a tendency that you find to abandon the more everyday sorts of spaces to a rather inferior management regime when you compare them with the big sort of civic set-piece type of spaces. So there's different types of management regimes in place, but broadly speaking, users seem to be pretty happy with the way that public space is cared for. Is public space invaded? Well, you might say the greatest single act of neglect of London's public spaces is the way that we've allowed them to become invaded by traffic. And certainly traffic continues to dominate large parts of London and many of its key public spaces. And what you find is that any attempts to take traffic out of our public spaces are very often met by storms of protest. And it makes these types of projects, where we're trying to remove traffic from the city, some of the most difficult projects to actually achieve. But when they are achieved, they are often some of the most successful projects, often rather modest projects. Talked about Trafalgar Square. If you actually look at what was done there, it's rather modest. It's only one side of the square was repaved and some changes of traffic elsewhere. But with a transformative effect on that part of London and on London as a whole. And the case studies we looked at shows it's not an all or nothing agenda. It's not either traffic or people. Actually, people and traffic can coexist rather well, side by side, and quite happily. Is London's public space exclusionary? Well, London, again, has always been exclusionary to some degree or other. There was no golden age where everybody had equal access to every public space in the city. That just isn't the nature of a mixed city, a socially mixed city like London, where people have different tastes, different abilities, and different opportunities open to them. But what you find when you start digging into some of the case studies is that poor design and narrow management practices can act to make places more exclusionary than they otherwise would do. For example, we found that across the spaces that we looked at, there's a domination of the use of public space by middle-class users and people, a dominance by the under 50s, broadly speaking. And when you start talking to users, it's simple things like spaces designed with seating without backs that make it difficult for people older people who, when they get to spaces, might like to sit and relax for a little while, but simply find them uncomfortable places to be. Nobody intended to put seating in which is deliberately uncomfortable, but it's the result of some of our design decisions. But nevertheless, a general sense that every space should and can be equally accessible and equally appealing to all seems to be rather doomed to failure. I think we need to recognise that London is a diverse and, you might argue, even a fragmented society, and inevitably we need to think about spaces that suit different sections of that society. Is London space segregated? Well, in fact, gating in London is pretty rare. There are, of course, examples of gating in London. I showed some earlier in one of the previous slides. But overwhelmingly, there's a sense when you talk to developers of public space that they see public space as a value-adding element. They don't wish to gate it off because to them it has all sorts of important benefits for their schemes. But what you also find is sometimes there's a demand from the public sector to create public spaces where really a public space is inappropriate. And you get problems of for example, here at Empire Square, where a space was created, but in fact, its management practices have since meant that there's a sort of unintentional segregation going on, because there's a basic conflict between the people who live there, who generally want a quiet environment to live and to rest and for their children to play, and other users in the locality who have a different perspective on what that space might be for. So there are sometimes some conflicts, and we need to remember that space for peaceful, private relaxation, play, and simple aesthetic enjoyment is just as valid in its right place as public space for public social functions. And we need to get that balance right and think what is appropriate in what location. Is London's public space insular? Well, there seems to be absolutely no evidence of a retreat from public space in London. No evidence of retreat from convivial public space into private realms. In fact, quite the opposite. All the spaces we looked at, new spaces and regenerated spaces, have a clear audience who values them and uses those spaces, and typically those spaces are those audiences are greatly enlarged and enhanced by the regeneration activities that were going on. So the evidence, if there is any, is of a much greater involvement in traditional public spaces in London, rather than a retreat into private realms. But again, it comes back to this issue around recognising where spaces for gregarious activities are appropriate and where they're not, and ensuring that management regimes recognise the different types of public spaces that we have in the city, and that some spaces are better for quiet enjoyment, whereas others are for more lively activities. Is London's public space privatised? Well, this is the most pervasive of the critiques that we see in the literature, of the case studies that we looked at, 5 were entirely private, managed and owned. 6 were entirely public, managed and owned. 3 were pseudo-public or pseudo-private, however you want to look at it. And privatised space and pseudo-private variants, of course, are pervasive today and have always been pervasive in London. Often it's not clear who owns and manages a space. Somerset House is a good example. The freehold is owned by the state. The leasehold is owned by a charitable trust. The space is shut for some months during the year for ice skating and other activities, which are revenue-generating activities, to sustain the space and the other activities there. So is it public? Is it private? Are our rights being constrained because at some points in the year it's shut and other points it's not? Well, these are not simple judgments that can be made. And some of the best used and most valued spaces that we found are entirely private spaces. The spaces in Canary Wharf, for example, are some of the most used and some of the most valued spaces of the 14 that we looked at by their audiences. But they have a different and complementary role, I would argue, to the public spaces, the purely public spaces, the publicly owned and managed spaces of the city. It doesn't have to be an either-or. Are London spaces consumption-orientated? Well, the origins of London, like many cities, lies in the bringing together of economic exchange opportunities with consumption potential. And so, of course, London spaces reflect that. Of the 14 spaces we looked at, 13 had some type of consumption opportunities. 3 of them were dominated by consumption activities. This creates opportunities to support positive life and activity, which gives character to spaces, but it also provides earning potential which can support other public goods, whether cultural, whether social housing, infrastructure, sporting activities, were all provided in some of the different case studies that we looked at, and very often cross-funded through different commercial and consumption activities. So whether subtle or significant, unique or ubiquitous in character, consumption typically enriches public space. And unless consumption is hidden from view, then you always run the risk that it may turn off some people because they don't like the particular things that are being offered in a particular place, or they simply don't have the money to engage in those opportunities. That's always going to be a risk in any public space. Users, when you ask them, accept difference. They accept different types of public spaces with different users and different types of consumption opportunities. Is London's public space invented? Well, to some extent you could say that all purposely designed public spaces are invented. They're consciously created and recreated places designed to deliver a certain type of experience, whether that is fun, imposing, relaxing, representational, whatever that experience is, all places are, to some extent or other, invented. In doing so, typically they draw inspiration from other models around the world or around London or around the UK. Users, when you ask them, are far less concerned about the authenticity of a space and much more concerned about the place experience. Is it for them a good place or is it not a good place? Not, is it an honest place? Is it an invented place? My penultimate critique, is London space scary? Well, security varies from permissive to uber-secured space around London, and across both public and private categories of space. The most secured space that we looked at was a public space, Euston Piazza, outside of Euston Station. It wasn't a private space at all. Public space managers shape their security response in response to what they see as real threats, whether that's terrorist action or just simply antisocial behaviour, but also in response to tenant demands. For users, scary space, whether there's security paraphernalia in a space or not, for users, it doesn't seem to make any difference to them in terms of their enjoyment of space. The day-to-day experience of users of public space, they tend to feel safe, interestingly enough, in spaces, whether there is security guards and CCTV or whether there isn't. And these things are ubiquitous across London anyway, whether it's public or private space. CCTV you find almost everywhere, and often more in public spaces than in private spaces. So again, there's not simple correlations between these things and the way spaces work and the way people feel. Finally, is London's public space homogenised? Well, actually, it's remarkably difficult to create homogenised public space in London, where space concepts, public space concepts, are some of the most worked over and long-running projects in the city. They're shaped and they're reshaped over a long and complex design and development processes in which typically they respond to urban contexts, sometimes more successful or less successful, but often those contexts are very complex. So homogenisation pressures clearly do exist. The most clear one is sort of franchised retail units, which you see spreading out across the city. But for users of public space, they're more concerned about architectural styles, international architectural styles, which they regard very often as more homogenising than actually the uses that go on in particular shops or cafes. But distinct designs, characterful urban contexts, and the natural life of spaces can help to reduce any homogenisation pressures. And well-designed spaces can withstand a degree of homogenisation. So, to come back to the question I asked, is it really that bad? Well, Our answer was no. Although there are areas where clearly we can do better. Much of London's public space is still neglected, many of the everyday spaces. Much of London's public space is still invaded, particularly by traffic. There's some unintentional exclusionary design that's going on. Sometimes, for some users, spaces are still scary. And in fact, the space that we found that was most problematic in that regard was the one where there was absolutely no security at all. And the problem in that case was it was isolated from the town centre, of which it was notionally a part. Users on the whole greatly value London's public spaces. There's no unwritten agenda to subvert London's public space. Stakeholders, whether public or private, typically have quite complementary aspirations for long-term social, economic and environmental value in their projects. To conclude, therefore, what marks out a city like London is the sheer diversity of its public spaces. In smaller cities with fewer public spaces, maybe these critiques have more resonance. But in London and other large cities, they can afford to have spaces of difference and diversity that don't all attempt to cater for every single member of society. Occasionally, spaces take on a life of their own, and they can be unrecognisable years down the line for what was originally envisaged. London's garden squares are the classic example. Designed many as glorified parking courts, actually, in their original incarnation. Many then became private gardens, and many have subsequently become public garden spaces. So spaces can change over time. For users in such a city, the choice is also diverse. Spaces for business, consumption, community, domestic sphere, the civic city, spaces of culture and entertainment. All are, and a mix of these functions mixed up together. And of course, there's always the option to shun public space altogether, if that's what individuals wish to do. This mix is something that we should celebrate. In London, we need to celebrate it, I believe, a little bit more. Thank you.